Some lessons weigh more than they look. That's what I was thinking the exact second Linda Whitmore's brand new silver SUV dipped forward like it had tripped over something invisible. It was 6:15 a.m., the same time it had been for the past 3 months, the same thin blue light stretching over our cul-de-sac, the same automatic sprinklers ticking on in perfect suburban rhythm. Only this time, instead of the hollow crack of plastic collapsing under rubber, there was a heavy, metallic thud that rolled through the street and settled into the silence like a dropped anvil. I stood on my front porch with a mug of black coffee warming my hands, steam rising into the cool Ohio air, and watched the moment everything shifted. The airbag bloomed inside her SUV like a startled cloud. A curl of white vapor drifted from beneath the hood. And right there, planted exactly 3 feet from the curb in full compliance with City Ordinance 12.4b, sat my trash can. Upright, unmoved, solid. You could still see the faint tire marks from the 17 previous accidents ghosted into the asphalt. 17 mornings of plastic shattering before sunrise. 17 times I'd walked barefoot down the driveway, gravel biting into my soles, the sour smell of spilled coffee grounds and crushed milk cartons hanging in the air, while Linda idled at the corner pretending she hadn't noticed. She always wore that same expression, tight smile, sunglasses too big for her face, hand resting on the steering wheel like she was conducting traffic instead of plowing through personal property. According to her certified letters, my trash placement was a community hazard. According to the ruler she once pulled from her purse, my grass exceeded the approved height by a 1/4 inch. According to Linda, I was the problem. I'm Daniel Harper, 45, electrician, divorced 3 years ago, but still fighting to keep weekends normal for my 2 kids. I moved to Willow Creek Estates because it promised quiet, order, predictability. I fix things for a living, wiring panels, tracing faults, solving problems most people never see behind drywall. I don't start conflicts. I troubleshoot them. The first time my trash can was knocked over, I believed it was a mistake. The second time, I replaced it with a heavier model. By the 5th time, I'd started documenting everything. Date, time, weather. By the 10th, I'd installed 4 discrete security cameras, angled like silent witnesses. By the 17th, I knew exactly how much force a 6,000-pound SUV generates at 12 miles per hour. The metallic taste of resolve settled in my mouth that morning as Linda stepped out of her vehicle, silk blouse catching the early light, shock replacing her usual confidence. She looked at the trash can, then at her bumper, then slowly toward my porch. The sprinklers kept ticking. Somewhere down the block, a garage door hummed open. Nothing about the neighborhood had changed. Same manicured lawns, same beige mailboxes, same quiet rules whispered through HOA newsletters. Except now the lesson she never saw coming was sitting 3 feet from the curb, bolted into place by patience, paperwork, and a little bit of physics. And for the first time in months, I didn't have to pick up a single piece of trash. Linda did not scream. She did not accuse. She did not even look at me right away. She just stood there gripping her driver's side door like it might steady the narrative she had rehearsed for months, and I could almost see the calculation behind those oversized sunglasses as she tried to decide whether this was still my fault somehow. The early morning air smelled faintly of cut grass and engine coolant, a sharp chemical edge mixing with the predictable suburban calm, and I took one slow sip of coffee before walking down the driveway, gravel crunching under my boots in a steady rhythm that felt earned. For 3 months before this morning, that rhythm had been different, hurried steps and bare feet, the sting of cold pavement while I upright shattered plastic and scooped up cereal boxes and coffee filters scattered like confetti across my driveway. My daughter, Emily, watching through the living room window with that quiet question in her eyes she was too polite to ask, and my son Tyler pretending not to notice while tightening the straps on his backpack. It always happened at exactly 6:15 in the morning, as precise as the sprinkler system that ticked across the lawns, and every time I would hear the low growl of Linda's 6,000-pound vehicle rolling a little too close to the curb before the hollow crack echoed across the cul-de-sac. The first incident I chalked up to poor visibility, the second to distraction, but by the fourth I had started noticing the pattern, the way she angled her turns slightly tighter than necessary, the way her brake lights never flashed, the way she never once stepped out to check on the damage. Instead, she would idle for a moment, then ease forward as if nothing had happened, leaving me to collect the pieces. When the certified letter arrived claiming my trash placement created a traffic hazard, printed on heavy paper with that faint smell of fresh toner, I realized this was not about maneuvering space. It was about control. According to the city code, refuse containers must be placed within 3 feet of the curb on collection day, and I measured twice every Tuesday. Tape measure extended to 36 inches exactly. Because if you are going to accuse an electrician of misalignment, you better believe he is going to verify every inch. Linda thrived on paperwork and perception, on the illusion that repetition makes something true, and each time she sent another notice citing community standards, she expected irritation to push me into retreat. What she did not account for was patience. I spent evenings at my kitchen table reviewing municipal ordinances instead of watching television, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence while I highlighted sections about property damage and right-of-way boundaries, and I positioned 4 security cameras discreetly along the eaves, each calibrated to capture timestamp footage from multiple angles. I did not confront her. I did not argue in HOA meetings. I did not raise my voice across driveways. I simply documented and waited, because when you work with electrical systems long enough, you learn that the loudest sparks usually come from invisible buildup, and pressure, when redirected correctly, does the work for you. Standing there that morning beside an upright trash can that had not budged an inch, I could feel the shift in momentum like a breaker snapping firmly into place. Not explosive, not dramatic, just decisive, and for the first time since moving into Willow Creek Estates, the pattern belonged to me. She finally looked at me, and for a split second I saw something unfamiliar in her expression, not anger, not authority, but uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when a script does not go the way it was rehearsed. Her voice, when it came, was tight and controlled, asking what I had done to the street as if reinforced concrete were a public conspiracy instead of a private upgrade, and I answered calmly that I had replaced damaged personal property with a more durable model, fully compliant with city placement requirements, installed entirely within my property line, and secured to prevent further so-called accidents. The word accident hung in the air between us like humidity before a storm, and I watched her jaw shift slightly as she processed the absence of apology in my tone. She glanced down at the base of the trash can, probably noticing for the first time the subtle steel plate flush with the asphalt, anchored beneath the surface with 4 expansion bolts rated for structural load, invisible unless you knew what to look for. Months earlier, when I realized the pattern would not stop, I had treated it like any other recurring fault in a system: trace the source, calculate the stress points, engineer a solution. I measured the curb clearance twice, verified setback regulations through the county website, and confirmed with a building inspector that anchoring a refuse container on private driveway space did not violate any code so long as it remained within the required 3-foot distance from the curb. And once I had documentation in hand, I drove to a local fabrication shop on the edge of town where the air smelled like oil and hot metal and ordered a composite reinforced container shell fitted around a concrete core weighing just under 240 pounds. From the outside, it looked identical to the previous model. Same green plastic texture, same hinged lid, same reflective strip along the front, but inside it carried the kind of weight that does not shift for convenience. The installation took one Saturday afternoon, drill humming steadily while my neighbor across the street pretended not to watch from behind lace curtains, and when I tightened the final bolt, I felt the same quiet satisfaction I get when a breaker panel clicks into perfect alignment. No sparks, no drama, just stability. I did not announce the upgrade at the next HOA meeting, even though Linda made a pointed comment about maintaining neighborhood harmony and safe vehicle navigation. I simply nodded and kept my notes organized in a manila folder labeled with dates and times, because harmony without accountability is just noise control. Back in the present, the faint hiss from her deflating tire cut through the still morning air, and I noticed curtains shifting in nearby windows as early commuters slowed to take in the scene. The neighborhood thrives on presentation, on smooth surfaces and carefully trimmed hedges, and now that surface had a visible dent. Linda reached for her phone, likely considering who to call first: insurance, the HOA board, maybe even the police, but the difference this time was documentation, not emotion, for camera angles had recorded the approach speed, the trajectory, the lack of braking, and the exact placement of the container. each frame timestamped down to the second. I could almost hear my daughter's voice from months ago asking quietly if we were going to move, and I realized that what she needed was not relocation, but resolution. As Linda finally stepped away from her vehicle and stared at the unyielding object she had treated like disposable plastic, the pattern that once belonged to her had fully reversed, not through confrontation, not through raised voices, but through preparation. And in that quiet Ohio morning, under the steady tick of sprinklers and the distant rumble of a school bus, the lesson settled heavier than the trash can ever had. The tow truck arrived before most of the neighborhood had finished their first cup of coffee, its diesel engine rumbling low and steady as it backed into the cul-de-sac, orange lights flashing against perfectly trimmed hedges and beige vinyl siding. The driver stepped out with a clipboard and a neutral expression, the kind of man who has seen every version of human pride dented by poor decisions, and Linda's voice shifted into something brighter, something rehearsed, as she explained that an obstruction in the roadway had caused mechanical failure. I stayed quiet, hands in my jacket pockets, feeling the cool morning air settle around us while sprinklers ticked in the background like a metronome keeping time. The driver walked over to my driveway, crouched near the base of the container, and ran his hand along the flush steel plate barely visible against the asphalt. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, then stood and looked at Linda's SUV, the front bumper misaligned, one tire sagging under the weight it had not expected to meet. "That is secured on private property," he said evenly, not to me, but to the air between us, and the statement carried more weight than accusation ever could. Linda's sunglasses were off now, her eyes sharp and searching, as if she were still trying to locate the part of the story where I was supposed to apologize. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the security app, for camera feeds synchronized, each angle capturing the same approach, the same unbroken line of motion, the same absence of braking. I did not shove the screen toward her. I simply let it rest in my hand, visible enough for anyone standing close to understand that this morning had witnesses beyond opinion. By 8 o'clock, 2 HOA board members had wandered down the sidewalk under the pretense of morning exercise, their steps slower than usual, their glances longer, and the quiet murmurs that ripple through neighborhoods built on perception began to shift tone. For months the narrative had painted me as careless, uncooperative, resistant to standards, but standards cut both ways, and documentation does not bend for social pressure. The tow truck lifted the SUV with a hydraulic whine, chains tightening carefully, and as it rolled away, the cul-de-sac returned to its staged calm. Except now there was a visible gap in the driveway where confidence had once parked. I spent the rest of the morning emailing 3 attachments to the HOA board, timestamped footage, copies of City Ordinance 12.4b, and a summary of previous documented incidents with dates and repair receipts totaling more than $400 in replacements. I did not accuse, I did not editorialize. I simply listed facts in clean, measured sentences the way I would document a wiring inspection for a client who wanted clarity, not drama. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a message from the board president requesting an emergency meeting that evening to discuss community safety concerns, and I could almost hear the shift in emphasis from my alleged hazard to the broader definition of accountability. When Emily and Tyler came home from school, backpacks thudding onto the hardwood floor, I told them calmly that we were staying, that sometimes solving a problem requires patience instead of packing boxes, and the relief in their shoulders was quieter than celebration but stronger than doubt. As the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the street, I stood by the anchored container once more, pressing lightly against its side just to feel the solid resistance. And I understood that what had changed was not the neighborhood, not the rules, not even Linda's personality, but the balance of certainty. The pattern had been interrupted, documented, and redirected, and in a place where image had always mattered more than evidence, evidence had finally arrived. The HOA meeting that evening smelled like burnt coffee and nervous cologne, the kind of scent that lingers in multipurpose rooms with folding chairs and fluorescent lights humming overhead. I took a seat near the back, manila folder resting on my lap, while the board members arranged themselves at the front table like a panel of reluctant judges. Linda was not there at first, which told me more than her presence ever could. When she finally walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a crisp white blazer, and the same tight smile she wore when handing out violation notices. The room shifted subtly, conversations lowering into careful whispers. The board president, a retired accountant named Howard Mills, cleared his throat and began with the phrase community safety, but the tone lacked conviction, like he was reading from a script he did not fully believe anymore. He referenced the incident that morning, describing it as unfortunate and unexpected, and then invited me to provide clarification regarding the installation on my driveway. I stood slowly, feeling the smooth edge of the folder against my fingertips, and spoke the way I do when explaining wiring diagrams to a homeowner who thinks electricity is magic, calm, precise, grounded in code. I outlined the timeline of repeated property damage, the 17 documented incidents with dates and photographs, the 4 security cameras capturing approach angles and speeds, and the verified compliance with municipal ordinance requiring placement within 3 feet of the curb. I explained the weight of the reinforced container, 240 pounds, secured entirely within my property boundary, not protruding into the public roadway, not violating any covenant listed in the Willow Creek Estates bylaws. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just facts laid out like clean copper lines before insulation. When I finished, the room felt different, less performative, more aware. One of the board members, a woman named Carol Jensen who rarely spoke during meetings, asked quietly whether there had been prior complaints about vehicle navigation in that section of the street. Howard shuffled papers and admitted there were none on record except those submitted by Linda. The subtle sound of chair legs shifting against tile carried more tension than any argument could have. Then Linda stood, insisting that the container constituted a deliberate trap, her voice measured but edged with frustration, and I responded simply that compliance is not a trap, documentation is not aggression, and reinforced property does not become illegal because someone expects it to move. I offered to share the full video footage with the board, including the absence of braking before impact, and Howard's expression tightened as he realized this was no longer a matter of aesthetics, but liability. Insurance companies, unlike homeowners, do not respond to narratives, they respond to evidence. The conversation turned practical after that, discussing risk exposure, repeated damage claims, and potential negligence. The word negligence hung heavier than any insult ever had. By the time the meeting adjourned, the energy in the room had shifted from policing grass height to preserving legal standing, and Linda left without her usual farewell, heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, the streetlights casting soft amber pools across the pavement, I felt something settle into place, not triumph, not revenge, just equilibrium. For months I had been reacting, cleaning up plastic fragments before sunrise, absorbing paperwork meant to intimidate. Now the system itself was adjusting, not because I demanded it, but because I prepared for it. The anchored container waited in the driveway, silent and solid under the porch light, and for the first time since moving here, the quiet felt earned rather than imposed. The next morning felt quieter, not because the neighborhood had changed, but because the tension had shifted direction. Instead of me waiting for the sound of plastic cracking at 6:15, I woke to nothing more than the soft click of the thermostat and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. The anchored container stood exactly where it belonged, 3 feet from the curb, lid closed, unmoved. No engine creeping too close. No calculated turn of the steering wheel. Just stillness. By mid-morning my phone buzzed with an email from Howard Mills, subject line reading board review outcome, and the wording inside was careful, almost clinical. After reviewing submitted documentation and video evidence, the board had concluded that repeated contact between Linda's vehicle and my refuse container constituted preventable driver error, not community obstruction. They also noted that no bylaw prohibited reinforcement of personal property so long as placement complied with municipal code. The message included a second paragraph that carried more weight than the first, a temporary suspension of Linda's authority to issue compliance notices pending further review. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because I understood what it meant. In neighborhoods like Willow Creek Estates, authority is rarely taken. It is simply assumed until someone measures it. Around noon, a white rental sedan rolled slowly into Linda's driveway, replacing the SUV that had dominated the cul-de-sac for years, and I watched from my garage while reorganizing a tool chest, the metallic scent of oil and steel grounding me in something familiar. I did not feel satisfaction, not the loud kind people expect in stories like this. What I felt was alignment. For months, I had adjusted my routine around her behavior, timing trash placement with caution, bracing for noise, absorbing paperwork meant to intimidate. Now the adjustment belonged to her. Later that afternoon, Carol Jensen knocked gently on my door, her expression softer than it had been at the meeting. She admitted that several neighbors had privately mentioned witnessing previous incidents, but never felt comfortable speaking up. She thanked me, not dramatically, just quietly, for documenting instead of escalating. The word escalating stuck with me because it had been the underlying assumption all along, that standing firm meant creating conflict, when in reality it meant refusing to absorb it. That evening, Emily and Tyler helped me roll the container back up the driveway after pickup, its weight steady and deliberate, and Tyler ran his hand along the side and said it felt solid, like it belonged there. I told him that most things do when you build them to withstand pressure instead of avoid it. The sun dipped behind identical rooftops, casting long shadows across driveways that once felt like stages for silent judgment, and for the first time since moving here, I did not scan the corner for headlights. There was no dramatic apology, no public confession, no shouting match under streetlights, just a shift in policy and a recalibration of control. Sometimes justice does not arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes it arrives through documentation, patience, and the simple act of refusing to let something be knocked over one more time. The container remained, quiet and grounded, not as a symbol of retaliation, but as proof that preparation outweighs intimidation, and in a neighborhood built on appearance, weight finally mattered. The week after the board's decision unfolded without spectacle, which in Willow Creek Estates counted as a quiet revolution. No more certified envelopes slid under my door, no more ruler inspections disguised as friendly strolls, and most noticeably, no engine drifting too close to the curb on Tuesday mornings. The rental sedan stayed centered in Linda's driveway, parked with exaggerated precision, as if overcorrection could erase history. I kept my routine unchanged on purpose. Container placed exactly 36 inches from the curb, lid facing the street, cameras still active, because consistency is stronger than celebration. A few neighbors began offering small nods when we crossed paths, the kind that say we saw more than we admitted, and I could feel the social current adjusting in subtle ways. Conversations that once stopped when I approached now continued, and the tone carried less judgment and more curiosity. One Saturday afternoon, Howard Mills stopped by with a folded copy of the updated HOA compliance policy, printed on crisp paper that still smelled faintly of ink, and pointed out a new clause requiring documented evidence before issuing violation notices, along with a clear appeals process and third-party review. It was not dramatic reform, but it was structural reinforcement, and structure is what prevents systems from leaning too far in one direction. He admitted quietly that the board had grown comfortable deferring to whoever spoke the loudest, and that comfort had blurred into assumption. Documentation, he said, had forced a reset. Inside my garage, the metallic scent of tools and sawdust felt steadier than it had in months, and I spent the afternoon organizing conduit fittings while Emily worked on a science project at the workbench, her voice light again, asking questions about voltage and resistance instead of whether we might have to move. Tyler practiced free throws in the driveway, the steady bounce of the basketball echoing against the anchored container, and each hollow thump sounded like punctuation on a sentence finally finished. Late that evening, as the sky shifted from blue to amber and porch lights flickered on in synchronized suburban rhythm, Linda stepped out onto her driveway with a clipboard in hand, then paused, looked toward my house, and slowly lowered it. There was no confrontation, no apology delivered across property lines, just the absence of interference, which in this neighborhood felt louder than any admission. The following Tuesday, the garbage truck arrived with its usual hydraulic hiss, metal arms lifting and emptying with mechanical precision. And when the container settled back onto the driveway without shifting an inch, the driver gave a small nod through the windshield, as if acknowledging the engineering without needing explanation. I realized then that what had shifted was not just policy or perception, but expectation. For months the expectation had been that I would adjust, absorb, relocate, apologize for occupying space exactly where I was permitted to stand. Now the expectation belonged to the rules themselves, measured in inches, recorded in frames per second, grounded in weight and code. In a place that once mistook repetition for authority, documentation had rewritten the pattern, and as I turned off the porch light that night, the street felt less like a stage and more like a street again, steady, predictable, and finally balanced. 3 weeks passed before the final piece clicked into place, and it did not arrive with sirens or shouting. Just with an envelope slipped neatly into my mailbox, stamped with the official return address of Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. The paper inside was heavier than the usual notices, the tone measured and deliberate, informing residents that Linda Whitmore had formally stepped down from her compliance role effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on other commitments. The language was polished, almost gentle, but anyone who had attended the emergency meetings knew the subtext was liability, documented incidents, and a board unwilling to defend the indefensible. I read the letter standing in my driveway, the late afternoon sun warming the concrete beneath my boots, and for a moment I let the silence settle in without rushing to define it. Across the street, curtains did not flutter anymore. People walked their dogs without glancing sideways. The rhythm of the neighborhood had evened out. That evening, Howard stopped by again, hands tucked into the pockets of his windbreaker, and explained that the board had conducted a closed review of past citations issued over the previous year. Several were rescinded, including the ones sent to me, and refunds for improperly assessed fines would be credited back to affected homeowners. He did not apologize in dramatic terms, but his voice carried something steadier than pride, an understanding that authority without accountability eventually collapses under its own assumptions. I thanked him, not triumphantly, just plainly, and watched as he walked back down the sidewalk lined with identical mailboxes that suddenly felt less like checkpoints and more like ordinary fixtures. On the next collection day, I placed the container exactly where I always had, measuring 36 inches from the curb out of habit rather than necessity. And when the garbage truck's hydraulic arm lifted and lowered it with mechanical precision, it landed in the same spot without shifting a fraction of an inch. The driver gave another small nod through the windshield, a silent acknowledgement of weight and preparation, and the moment felt less like victory and more like closure. Inside the house, Emily was laughing at something on her phone. Tyler's basketball thudded steadily against the driveway, and the air carried the familiar scent of cut grass and summer pavement instead of tension. Later that night, as I reviewed the camera footage one last time before archiving it to an external drive, I noticed something subtle in the final frames from weeks earlier, the exact instant before impact when Linda's vehicle could have adjusted course but did not. That single frame reminded me that problems rarely appear without warning. They build through repetition, through unchecked patterns that feel small until they are not. I powered down the monitor, slid the manila folder into a drawer, and turned off the porch light, leaving the anchored container resting quietly in its place, not as a monument to conflict, but as a reminder that patience reinforced by preparation weighs more than intimidation. In a neighborhood that once mistook volume for authority, the heaviest thing on the street was not concrete or steel, it was evidence, and evidence does not need to shout to be heard. By the time autumn settled over Willow Creek Estates, the air carried the dry scent of fallen leaves instead of tension, and Tuesday mornings felt like any other morning in any other neighborhood, predictable and quiet. I would roll the container down the driveway, measure out 36 inches without thinking, and step back knowing it would remain exactly where I placed it. No engines drifting too close, no calculated turns of the steering wheel, no plastic cracking before sunrise. The pattern that once defined my week had dissolved into something ordinary, and there is a certain power in ordinary when you have earned it. Linda kept to herself after stepping down, her rental eventually replaced by a modest sedan that moved carefully through the cul-de-sac, always centered, always cautious. We never exchanged words about what happened, and we did not need to. Some conversations take place in documentation, in policy updates, in the absence of repeated behavior. The HOA newsletter that month featured a new section titled Resident Rights and Responsibilities, printed in clean black font without decorative borders, outlining clear procedures for disputes and evidence requirements for citations. It read less like a warning and more like a contract grounded in fairness. I watched Emily rake leaves into neat piles that rustled under her sneakers, Tyler practicing free throws beneath a sky that turned amber at dusk, and I realized how close I had come to teaching them the wrong lesson, that sometimes the only option is to retreat when someone louder claims authority. Instead, they watched preparation outweigh intimidation, saw that calm documentation can shift entire systems without raised voices or reckless reactions. One evening, as I was closing the garage, the metallic scent of tools mixing with the crisp October air, I ran my hand along the side of the anchored container and felt the solid resistance beneath the composite shell. It was never about the weight alone. It was about what that weight represented, boundaries measured and reinforced, patience turned into structure. I archived the final camera recordings onto an external drive and labeled the folder simply Willow Creek Documentation, not because I expected to need it again, but because preparation is not a one-time act, it is a mindset. The neighborhood lights flickered on in synchronized rhythm as dusk settled, identical houses lined in warm yellow glow. And for the first time since moving here, the street felt like a place rather than a battleground disguised as a cul-de-sac. People waved without hesitation. Children rode bicycles without navigating around tension, and the quiet no longer felt fragile. Sometimes justice does not arrive as a dramatic showdown or a public apology. Sometimes it settles in slowly, in policy revisions, in careful parking, in the simple absence of repeated harm. I learned that authority built on assumption can feel heavy until it meets something heavier, and that something does not have to shout or threaten to make its point. As I turned off the porch light and looked down the steady line of driveways stretching beneath the autumn sky, I understood that the heaviest object on this street was not concrete or steel. It was the refusal to be pushed aside, grounded in code, documented in frames per second, and anchored exactly 3 feet from the curb where it always belonged.